Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Monday, July 19th, 2021. On today's episode, we're going to discuss the latest film and TV news. This is Slash Film editorial director Peter Sciretta, and joining me on his podcast is senior writer and weekend editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
So we have a bunch of news. A lot of it involves Marvel in some way, and some of it is spoiler-ish. We'll keep the spoiler-ish news till later in the episode. So if you have not seen Loki or Black Widow, we'll give you a heads up on when you can tune out then. But everything up front is not a spoiler as far as I know. So, right before we were about to hit record on this podcast, news just broke. So we're going to get to this briefly. I don't really have much on this because Chris Evangelista is actually currently writing the story as we speak, and that is we have a director for the Blade reboot from Marvel Studios. Brad, tell us about it.
Yeah, as we found out not too long ago, there's a Blade reboot on the way from Marvel that will star Mahershala Ali as the vampire hunter. And now we have a director for the movie. Deadline found out that Bassam Tariq, who is best known for directing a movie called Mogul Mowgli starring Riz Ahmed, will be taking the helm of this new version of Blade. He's kind of an up-and-coming director. Mogul Mowgli is his best-known film, and it actually
it hasn't even come out domestically. It's only been out overseas, right?
Yeah, and but it did win a BAFTA over there. It won Outstanding British Film of the Year in 2020, so that bodes well for him as a filmmaker. Previously, he also directed a couple documentaries. One called 11-8-16 and another called These Birds Walk. So this is, continues kind of the trend of Marvel taking a chance on more up-and-coming filmmakers who haven't gotten a lot of experience in the blockbuster arena. People like, Kate Shortland and Chloe Zhao. And so they're clearly putting their films, in the hands of more auteur filmmakers, hopefully, giving them a little bit more style and varying things up a bit as opposed to sticking to the traditional Marvel formula.
Yeah, and they've also been giving a chance to a lot of people coming out of Sundance. Like that first film that he did, that documentary you mentioned, Three Birds Walk, was a Sundance-funded documentary that he co-directed. And he was named one of the Filmmaker Magazine's 25 new faces to watch in independent film in 2012. So he's been around for quite some time. He actually started out as a blogger for like sites like Boing Boing. So he was one of us at one point. And he's from Pakistan, and he did a TED Talk talking about Muslim diversity. And we'll link that in the show notes. But it's great to see Marvel giving a chance to someone who probably wouldn't get a chance otherwise. I want to say that because he doesn't have like this long track record of films, and also people of from this background usually don't get a shot to direct like a big budget Marvel movie. And I think Disney and Marvel have really have made it a goal to diversify the storytellers that are making these upcoming stories, which is actually very cool. But I have not seen either of his films. I've heard that the one that's coming out, what was it called? Mowgli?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it stars Riz Ahmed, and it's like about this British Pakistani rapper who's based in New York, and before his European tour begins, he's diagnosed with this degenerative autoimmune disease, and he returns to see his Pakistani family in London. So it sounds interesting. And I'm excited to check it out, especially now that we know that this guy's going to have this huge future in these big films that like we're all excited to see and talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get on to the news that we actually intended to talk about. I feel bad because like this just broke like seconds before we started recording, and neither of us have any knowledge of this guy's work. But
it's still early, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about Blade and dive into this guy's work. That's the tough thing, about when hiring filmmakers who are a little more lower key in the industry is it's hard to keep up with everything. But we have plenty of time to dig into that stuff before the movie gets into production and whatnot.
And I do love that because then you see a rush of people going out to seeing this film when it comes out in the U.S. and you'll people I'm sure going to flock to this documentary that he made. Actually, he made 2 documentaries. It does spread the love. But speaking, from a director that we don't know much about, let's go to a director that we know a lot about.
Maybe too much.
Maybe too much. Yeah, and that is Kevin Smith. Clerks 3 is finally happening. Brad, tell us about it.
Yeah, this movie's been in the works for a long time now. Kevin Smith has talked about wanting to do Clerks 3, and at one point there was a complete script. It sounded like he was ready to go, but then it just didn't come together, largely because Jeff Anderson, who plays Randall in the View Askew universe, as it's known, just wasn't interested in coming back. But now, apparently, Kevin Smith he created a whole new script after the near-death experience he had when he had a heart attack a few years back, and basically overhauled his story for Clerks 3, tied that into it, and turned it into something completely different. And Lionsgate has officially announced that they've bought the rights to the script. They're going to be providing the funding for it. So Kevin Smith finally gets to make it. And it's going to be, for better or worse, his most self-referential and self-indulgent movie yet, because here's the brief logline as described in the official press release from Lionsgate. In Clerks 3, following a massive heart attack, Randall enlists fellow clerks Dante, Elias, Jay, and Silent Bob to make a movie immortalizing his life at the convenience store that started it all. And so if you're getting a nosebleed right now, that's because this is a very Inception-esque movie plot, because the original Clerks, that came out in the early 90s as a Sundance movie, launched Kevin Smith's career, was a movie based on Kevin Smith's own life as a convenience store clerk. And, then we got Clerks 2, and now we're getting Clerks 3, which is about these characters that he created about his own life, making the movie that was about his own life to begin with. So, oh boy. I don't know. I like.
Did they already just make a movie about the making of Clerks? Didn't that come out like a year or two ago?
Yeah, but Kevin Smith didn't make it. I think he might have thrown his name on as an executive producer and had a cameo, I think, or something like that. But yeah, some other filmmaker who is a Kevin Smith fan made a movie about the making of Clerks.
So I don't know. Before I get to what you think of this, Brad, I mean, I'm excited that Jeff Anderson is back because I can't see them doing a Clerks movie without him. Like, he's one half of Clerks.
For sure.
You need him. And also Rosario Dawson is back, which is exciting because she was the best part of Clerks too. I will say this to counter your worry that this might be too self-indulgent, that I love when filmmakers make things that are personal stories. And especially Kevin Smith, I would say, Clerks and Chase and Amy, which are both 2 of his most personal films, are probably 2 of his best films.
For sure. And I think for me, it's just that it feels like it has the potential to be a little too much. It's just a little too meta. I'm a Kevin Smith fan, even though I haven't loved, his more recent work. And I feel like Jay and Silent Bob didn't quite, hit the mark as far as matching up to the style and comedy of his previous movies. Cause it's just something has changed about his approach to comedy, that it isn't quite what it used to be. Some of it may also be me, growing up a little bit and not as entertained by the same dick and fart jokes, stoner antics. But I really like Clerks 2, actually. I know that a lot of people were disappointed in it and whatnot, but I feel like it has its heart in the right place. And I do like the dynamic between Randall and Dante. So I'm interested to see what he does here. I'm at least, intrigued by the premise, but I am worried that it will... like I said, be a little too self-indulgent, but we'll see.
Yeah. Like you, I was a huge Kevin Smith fan. And I feel like the last, handful of movies have not been my cup of tea, including Yoga Hosers, which I couldn't even get through. And I was watching it in a theater at Sundance at the premiere. I'm just glad that he's making movies that aren't based on, some conversation on a podcast while he was high. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems like hopefully this one is better, well thought out. That's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, at the very least, it'll probably be something very personal to him.
Yeah.
So, maybe that'll help as well.
Yeah. But I want to see Kevin Smith do well. Like I really like that guy, and when he is a good storyteller. I know some people like to get on him about him not being a great filmmaker, and I feel like he can be a great filmmaker at times, and he is a great storyteller. If you go to any of his Q&As or watch any of his Q&As on home video, like you can see how great of a storyteller he is. So given the room, given also if he wants to prove himself again, I think that this might be interesting. So okay, let's move on to this weekend's box office, which tells some interesting tales. But let's first talk about the winner of the box office. Brad, who was it? Was it Space Jam or was it Black Widow?
It was Space Jam, A New Legacy, surprisingly. This was something that analysts weren't expecting. The early predictions and projections for the opening weekend for the sequel were around 20 million. But the movie ended up raking in about 31.6 million, and it dethroned Black Widow from its number one spot. Everyone thought Marvel would be able to stay on top for at least a couple weekends, but the 31% critical rating on Rotten Tomatoes didn't stop everybody from going to see Space Jam: A New Legacy, and neither did the fact that it's streaming on HBO Max right now. It didn't completely destroy its box office prospects. So, it's crazy because it's this is a time too where like movies, even though they're getting wide release and blockbusters are coming back to theaters, audiences are still not fully prepared to come back in the numbers that they usually are. And 31.6 million wouldn't necessarily be a great opening weekend for a movie like this if it were the normal times before, the pandemic. But this is the fourth highest opening weekend of the year in the pandemic so far. And it's the biggest family opening of the year, actually even into the previous year during the pandemic as well. But since we saw, The Croods and A New Age get released. But it's, there's a whole thing about how this is relatively disappointing for Black Widow's box office performance as well.
I wanted to talk about that. But before we talk about that, have HBO announced how much it has done? Well, I guess it hasn't done. Like, it's not like the Disney model where you're buying an extra thing, right? Like,
exactly.
Included.
Yeah, there's no like box office total. I don't know if it usually takes them a little while longer to get like the streaming ratings in, as far as like how many people watched it like in its first weekend and stuff like that. So, and that's always more complicated too, because like you don't always get a breakdown of like how many people watched it,
finished it,
and finished it, or watched half of it and gave up or so.
Yeah, even the Disney numbers last week, I think one of my friends did the math, and is as great as that. How much did it do on Disney Plus? It was like 60 million or something.
Yeah.
Even those numbers, that relates to like something like 2 or 3% of all of Disney Plus subscribers bought it. So it's not like when you have to pay money, it's not all your subscribers, even though that's like a big number.
Yeah.
So Black Widow last week debuted with 80 million domestically, broke the pandemic box office records. And, Disney sent out this press release. They announced that, that made so much money at the box office, made so much money on Disney Plus. It's doing so well. Well, this second week at the box office told an interesting, different tale here. It represents a huge drop. What is the drop here? I don't have it in front of me.
67%.
Yeah, 67%, which I think is one of MCU's biggest. It's their worst second weekend drop in history, besting 62% by the previous record holder, Spider-Man: Homecoming and Ant-Man and the Wasp. Both of them still went out to do solid totals even after that drop, I want to mention. But with that, NATO is the National Association of Theater Owners. They're the ones that put on what used to be called Show West, but is now called CinemaCon. They're the organization of all the movie theater owners, and they've been so against this day and date thing. They've been the ones that have been pushing against the studios that wanted to release premium VOD, and they released this this press release, basically saying that, I'll read a quote from it here. Despite assertions that this pandemic era improvised release strategy was a success for Disney, and the simultaneous release model it demonstrates that an exclusive theatrical release means more revenue for all the stakeholders in every cycle of the movie's release. So NATO is basically, yelling to the rafters, being like, if Black Widow was just released in theaters and didn't get a release on Disney Plus, it would have had longer legs at the box office. It could have made money at, on home video on Disney Plus later on, and everybody's losing on the money here. Brad, what do you think?
I mean, it's one of those things where we're still, like I said, with Space Jam, it's not a super impressive haul, but in these times it still works. And so I hesitate to say that this is something that should be like a huge concern, because we're talking about a mishmash of different things that have affected the box office, from it being available on Disney Premier Access to audiences not fully coming back to theaters yet. So since it's only 5% more of a drop from previous wide releases, that's not a terrible thing. I'm sure it'll end up hurting Disney and Marvel's bottom line a little bit, but at the same time, it's not as if Marvel movies are on the way out and people are caring less. I don't think this could be a matter of just the timing.
No, but is it an indicator of this model of release of doing day and date? Is this going to result in the studios making less money?
I mean, I doubt it, because I honestly think that the previous box office performance of movies, right now shows that people are ready to come back to theaters. But right now we're just still in such an uncertain time that they're not coming out in full droves, and that's why studios are still doing this day and date release for some of these movies, and that's not going to be the case for future Marvel movies. That's not going to happen with Eternals or Spider-Man No Way Home. So I don't think that we're going to see the same issue as far as movies maybe that are not as reliable at the box office. I think it remains to be seen. So some studios have talked about how they'll kind of consider on a case-by-case basis which movies they'll give a longer theatrical release to, or give a VOD release to earlier in its theatrical window. So it's, for now, I feel like it's still too early, just because we're still coming out of the pandemic, and we really won't have a grasp on it, I would say, until towards the end of the year or early next year.
Yeah. And honestly, if you compare it to Ant-Man and the Wasp, which was close by that number, I think Ant-Man and the Wasp is a comparable franchise, right? Because they appeared in a previous film. I don't think Black Widow was ever going to do, the numbers that, the biggest of the Marvel movies do. Maybe a Black Widow 2 if they could have done that. But yeah, so I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see this war, because I think this is just heating up of NATO and the theater owners pushing back against studios wanting to do this day and date release, and what the after effects of this pandemic is going to provide. But okay, we have a lot more to talk about. Let's go on to Loki. The first story we have here is not a spoiler, but the director of Loki season 1 is not going to return for season 2. Brad, tell us about it.
Yes, unfortunately, while doing press rounds in the wake of the finale for the first season of Loki, director Kate Herron confirmed that she will not be returning for a second season. It's not really anything where there's a problem or any disagreements, but she signed on for the first season, and initially when they started working on the show, they weren't planning on doing a second season. So it's not as if this was meant to be a big deal for Kate Herron to stay on and stick around and stay with Loki as long as it lasted. The cliffhanger at the end of the second season was kind of a last minute decision once they realized they could do more with the story and keep Loki going. And so Kate Herron won't be doing anything for Loki season 2. She's not doing anything else with Marvel either. She's got some other stuff, I guess, she's working on that is yet to be announced. But yeah, so she's just focused more on her stuff, but she'd love, working with Marvel and would be glad to do something with again, but it's just not happening right now.
Yeah. I do want to take to task one statement you said there, Brad, that like this ending was like a last minute decision. I feel like you mean that it was the last minute in like while they were developing the series.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's not like they were like they were getting towards the end of the show and they were like, oh shit, we should probably do a second season. It came later on, like once they got into shooting and they were like, okay, this is something we can keep going.
Yeah, because you can't get an ending to a season like that and not have something planned.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah. Okay, now we're going to get into spoilers for Loki and Black Widow. So if you haven't seen Loki, tune out now. Okay, so Loki director Kate Herron, the how do I talk about this? Okay, so everybody here has seen Loki at this point. If you haven't, tune out now. In the last episode, they introduced He Who Remains, who is a character who is going to appear in other Marvel movies, including Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. And it turns out the director, Kate Herron, had a role in casting this character. Brad, tell us about it.
Yeah, so we've known for a while that Kang the Conqueror was going to be the villain of Ant-Man and the Wasp. It was announced last fall, and Jonathan Majors, who plays He Who Remains in Loki, was cast in that role. So when it was finally confirmed in the finale that Jonathan Majors was making an appearance in Loki as He Who Remains, which is a variant of Kang the Conqueror in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then we knew that this was going to be a much bigger deal in the future. And He Who Remains himself confirmed that by saying that once the multiverse is opened up, there are a bunch of variants of himself and King the Conqueror that will begin to wage a multiversal war and wreak havoc across the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And so since Loki was introducing this character before he would become a much bigger player in the MCU, she worked alongside Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania director Peyton Reed in casting Jonathan Majors for the role, which is pretty cool that they, brought her in on the process and had to figure it out, since she was the one responsible for introducing the first version of this character that we're going to see in the MCU.
Yeah, it's also interesting, though, because I feel like Jonathan Majors and how he performs this character in this series is probably not how King the Conqueror, how he's going to perform King the Conqueror. I feel like that's going to be a different persona altogether. So she's responsible for casting this guy that's going to have to go do other things. But I Marvel's done that in the past. Like, like the Russo brothers cast Tom Holland as Spider-Man for Civil War. And that was before, he was going to go on to the Spider-Man Homecoming. And I think they did the same thing with Captain Marvel. Am I right about that? Or maybe it was the other way around on that one. But so obviously directors are responsible for casting characters that end up having bigger lives through other filmmakers and storytellers in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I think it's cool that they let her have a hand in this casting, because he has such a huge role in this Marvel show. And also, it just occurred to me now, Brad, I was just thinking about this while I was talking, how how these Marvel shows are kind of like these showcases for these characters. Like WandaVision is kind of like the birth of Scarlet Witch, and how Falcon and Winter Soldier is obviously the birth of the new Captain America. And I was thinking what Loki means. Loki is more so a surprise origin story for King the Conqueror than it is actually Loki. I mean, I guess it is Loki coming into his own, being a anti-hero protagonist. But I don't know. I just didn't expect that going into the show. So, and also, like, didn't we learn that character was actually previously owned by Fox?
Well, so we didn't like. I mean, it's a bit complicated because one of the versions of King the Conqueror is Nathaniel Richards, and he's the father of Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, and the Fantastic Four. And so there's a bit of a complicated history where Fox had the rights to Kang. But then once that character came over now, since Fox is part of Disney, it wasn't a big problem anymore. So all the characters of the X-Men and Fantastic Four comics are now back under the Marvel umbrella, so they didn't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, so he's now the first MCU character previously owned by Fox. I mean, actually,
well, so interestingly enough, so technically before this happened, Deadpool kind of became the first one in a weird roundabout way because last week there was this promo for Ryan Reynolds' new movie Free Guy that had Deadpool and Korg, the character from Thor Ragnarok, voiced by Taika Waititi, sitting together on a couch and doing a reaction video to the Free Guy trailer. So technically that's kind of the first one, but in the grand scheme of the MCU, this is the first like legitimate and meaningful appearance of a previously owned Marvel character that was in Fox's wheelhouse.
Yeah, just worth noting. Okay, let's move on to Black Widow. So if you haven't seen the ending of Black Widow, you'll want to, leave us now. But in the ending, we have the introduction, or what would be the introduction, I guess, in the if you put the series of events in chronological order, introduction of a new character. And we were theorizing on the character. We were theorizing on our podcast about where this character, what their future is in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And now Kevin Feige gives us a little bit of a hint. Brad, tell us about it.
Yes, Kevin Feige obviously is making publicity rounds for Black Widow right now. And conversation turned to the credits scene from the end of Black Widow, which brings back Julia Louis-Dreyfus as Contessa Valentina Allegra de Fontaine. And she, as we've talked about before, she gives Yelena Belova, the character played by Florence Pugh, Natasha Romanoff's adoptive sister, some somewhat manipulative news about how her sister died, and says that it was at the hands of Hawkeye. And so we're made to understand that Yelena has been working for Val for some time, and this comes after her debut in Falcon the Winter Soldier, where she recruited John Walker as U.S. agent for some kind of work. We don't know what. And so Kevin Feige was finally asked, exactly what Val is up to. And in perfect Feige response, he teased but didn't give much, information by saying she's doing something. She seems to be in recruitment mode. Does Yelena already work for her? They seem to have a connection at that point, yes. And so beyond that, Feige kind of pretended like he's a guy who's just a fan and doesn't know what's going on. But he says, the notion of bringing her into the world was always something, if we could find the right thing, was something we wanted to do. And when this role came about and the opportunity to have her in Black Widow and Falcon and Winter Soldier, and maybe in some other things coming up, Julie Louis-Dreyfus was totally on board and really into it. So it's an amazing addition to the world, and I look forward to people being surprised by just where she'll show up next.
And about that moment, it's funny because Black Widow's screenwriter, Eric Pearson, said in an interview recently with The Hollywood Reporter, he was asked if he knew where this was going, because he wrote this moment that is at the end of this movie. And he actually admitted that he has no idea, that like he was just kind of told what it needed to accomplish. But there's a quote here. He's like, I was like, who am I screwing over? Something is going on. I don't have an answer for this, Pearson told The Hollywood Reporter with a laugh. They were like, you don't need to. We're going to figure that out. I remember writing and feeling super guilty. I hope whatever writer I'm working on this next, who is working on this next chapter, is going to be okay with what I've done for them. I don't know. Is it only me that finds that extremely funny that like the people that are responsible for these like end credit stingers on these Marvel movies don't necessarily have any idea what they're even setting up?
Yeah, for sure. And I think part of that too, is maybe to Marvel's benefit, because it means that they don't have to get too specific in the scene, and it allows them some freedom to like play with whatever is going to happen in the future, as opposed to locking them into something that could easily change as, things go on.
Yeah, this used to really bug me. This used to annoy me because part of me is like, the whole argument of like Star Wars should have had a treatment planned out for the sequel trilogy. Why didn't they have a plan? And then the other part of it is like, if you don't the Marvel comics themselves operate in this way where one writer will write an arc and leave it off in, certain way for another writer to take over and have to continue that story. And there isn't really much of a plan. And it always kind of bugged me with the Marvel Cinematic Universe because there's things that don't really make sense. Like there's this moment, I forget which movie this was. Was this Civil War or was it Ant-Man, where like Thanos gets the Infinity Gauntlet out of a safe and he says, "Fine, I'll take care of this myself," or something like that. And then we get like Infinity War where he doesn't take care of himself. He has like these, this whole ragtag group of helpers. So it doesn't really make much sense. But how do you feel about this?
I mean, for me, it's not quite as egregious as I think the issues there were with the new Star Wars trilogy and not planning things out from the get-go, because, Marvel does have the ability to like adapt and be flexible and figure out how to shape things to fit into the other movies and things like that. And it's a little bit easier for them too, because they have a whole comic mythology that they can work from that allows them to, make connections and repurpose characters and all this sort of thing. So in this case, it works for them and it allows, them some freedom that actually helps. But like, there's just some stories, it requires more planning and things to like get ahead, especially just because of the structure of Star Wars, as opposed to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is this ongoing, all encompassing, overarching thing.
The other thing is, I think like the comics, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is set up in a certain way where they have someone like an editor that's overseeing the whole thing. They have, a Kevin Feige, and that's not what Star Wars didn't have that for the sequel trilogy. And I feel like that's what they lost, because you're right. You don't need a treatment for the entire sequel trilogy. You just need someone to keep it consistent. So it feels like it's, continuing story, not written by two different filmmakers at war with each other. Right. But okay. Let's talk about our final story. This is also Black Widow, which apparently could have featured Iron Man or Hawkeye.
Kind of, I guess, but not really. It was, these are mostly like rumors that started to get like accepted as fact, and they kind of got blown out of proportion. The first one was, there's this ongoing rumor that Robert Downey Jr. was going to make an appearance as Tony Stark in Black Widow, but that's something that writer Eric Pearson was a little confused by, and initially he denied that there was ever any consideration of a Tony Stark appearance, but then he remembered that there was at one time a very early draft of Black Widow that made reference to including the end scene from Civil War where Tony and Natasha are talking to each other, but it was never meant to be a new scene with Tony Stark that would have utilized Robert Downey Jr. in any way. It was just old footage, potentially even an alternate take from the footage they shot for Captain America Civil War, just as kind of a reminder to let the audience know the time period in which Black Widow took place. So there was never meant to be any actual new scene with Tony Stark. So that's why that, didn't happen.
But what about Hawkeye? I feel like Hawkeye is what a lot of us expected, especially when Hawkeye and Black Widow had that interaction in, what movie was it? They were talking about
Avengers, and like they talk about being in Budapest, and you and I remember Budapest very differently. And so a lot of people thought that we would see Hawkeye popping up at some point in Black Widow, especially since in the movie they do end up going back to Budapest. But as we find out, she didn't really need Hawkeye during this. What was happening, since she already had help from Yelena and then her adoptive, mother and father. But we do find out what Black Widow and Hawkeye did do in Budapest previously, because she ends up using some familiar locations that she and Hawkeye had to hide in when they were on the run before. And the main reason that they actually didn't bring back Hawkeye for any assistance to her is that director Kate Shortland talked about Kevin Feige actually being the one who said, quote, "She doesn't need the boys." So they really wanted to make an effort for Black Widow to just stand on her own and not call in any of the other Avengers, even if it wasn't any of, the boys, as he says. They just wanted her to be able to do this on her own, and then also with her adoptive family, which is a big part of, fleshing out her story. So that's why Hawkeye doesn't appear in Black Widow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. If you want to find out more of any of the stories we talked about in today's podcast, we'll link them in the show notes. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday on Apple, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free to send us your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to us at peter@slashfilm.com. And please rate and read this podcast in Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.